Let me take you back to the endless blue of the Pacific sky, a place where courage met fire and silence could be shattered in a heartbeat. It was 1943, and the air above the ocean was no longer peaceful. It roared with engines and echoed with the thunder of dogfights. American pilots flew missions that tested not only skill, but the very will to live. They knew the Japanese Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the Betty as it was code-named. They called it the Flying Lighter, because when it was hit, it erupted into flame almost instantly. They had seen it time and again. A single burst of .50 caliber fire would send it blazing down into the sea, but the mystery lingered. Why did it burn so easily? How could an aircraft so vital to Japan's war effort be so fragile, so easily destroyed? The answer would come one humid afternoon on a captured airstrip in the Solomons. American engineers and pilots gathered around a battered green bomber. Its paint scorched, its insignia faded. They had captured a Betty intact, the first of its kind to fall into American hands. And now the truth of its weakness was about to be laid bare. The men circled the plane like surgeons around a patient, its fuselage dented and riddled with bullet holes told the story of how it had fought. But when they opened the wings and examined the tanks, what they found left them silent. No armor, no self-sealing rubber, no protection at all. It was a flying coffin, and yet thousands of Japanese airmen had gone to war in it, believing it could take them home that day. The Americans didn't cheer at their discovery. They simply looked at one another in disbelief. Because for all their enemies' determination, this machine told another story, one of desperation, of sacrifice, and of a nation gambling everything on speed and hope. The captured Betty sat under the Pacific sun, its green skin glimmering faintly with oil and salt. It looked almost harmless, resting their wings, outstretched like a wounded bird that had fallen from heaven. But every man who stood near it felt the weight of what it represented, a machine built for war, yet cursed by its own design. American pilots volunteered to fly it not out of thrill, but out of duty. They wanted to understand the enemy. They wanted to know what kind of courage it took to fly a bomber that could ignite with a single spark. The engines coughed to life, twin throbbing sounds that filled the humid air with vibration. The plane shook as if it were waking from death. Slowly, it taxied down the dirt runway, its propellers slicing through heat and dust. Then it lifted with surprising grace, soaring upward against the golden Pacific sky from the ground. The men watched in silence. One of them muttered that it looked beautiful up there, but beauty meant nothing in war, because inside that cockpit, the pilot could feel the danger with every vibration. The fuel tanks lay exposed behind thin metal walls. A stray bullet would pierce them like paper and set the whole aircraft ablaze. When he brought the plane down and climbed out, sweat ran down his neck and his eyes were wide. He said it felt like flying a bomb. A single hit in combat would turn the entire aircraft into a rolling inferno. That night around the camp's firelight, they talked quietly. They respected the Japanese pilots more than ever. To climb into a machine that fragile day after day took a kind of bravery words could not capture. But it also told the Americans something deeper about their own war. That courage alone was not enough. It had to be paired with wisdom and engineering. And in that contrast, they saw the difference that would decide the Pacific War. The next morning, the engineers moved in with tools and notebooks, ready to tear the Betty apart. They wanted to see not just what it looked like, but what it meant. Every rivet, every weld, every corner spoke of choices made under pressure, choices that revealed the soul of the war. When they peeled back the panels, they saw a design built around one obsession: speed. The Betty had been made to outrun danger, not withstand it. Its engines were powerful, its lines sleek, and its body astonishingly light. It could carry torpedoes across hundreds of miles and strike deep into enemy waters faster than most bombers of its kind. But speed had come at a cost. The Japanese designers had stripped away everything that added weight: armor, plating gone, self-sealing tanks gone, reinforced bulkheads gone. The Americans stood in disbelief. One engineer ran his hand across the thin sheet of aluminum that separated the fuel tank from the pilot's seat. He could feel the heat of the morning sun bleeding through it. That thin metal was all that stood between life and death for every man who flew this plane. As the engineers talked, the pilots listened. They began to understand why so many Bettys exploded midair when hit by American fire. The .50 caliber rounds from their fighters tore through the skin and ripped open the tanks like they were nothing. One spark, and the plane was a torch. But it wasn't just weakness they saw. It was philosophy. The Japanese had gambled on agility, believing that a plane fast enough to evade fire didn't need protection. They were wrong, but they had believed it with conviction. And in that belief was a strange kind of tragedy. For the Americans, it was a revelation. Technology without protection meant death, and that truth would shape the future of American aircraft design. From that day on, the more they studied the Betty, the clearer its story became. It was not just a bomber. It was a reflection of Japan's desperation in the sky. Its design screamed ambition, but whispered sacrifice. It could fly far and strike fast, yet it could not take a hit and live. Me take you inside the mind of the Japanese engineers who built it. They were fighting an impossible war stretched thin across oceans, outmatched in resources and material. Every pound of armor they added meant a mile of range lost, every ounce of protection meant one less chance to reach the target. So they stripped the bomber bare, leaving it light, swift, and deadly. At least in theory, but that choice came with a terrible cost. For every mission launched dozens, never returned. The Bettys carried crews who knew one tracer round could turn their sky into fire. Still they climbed into those planes, not for glory but for duty. They flew through walls of American gunfire, their faith stronger than the metal around them. When American intelligence reviewed the wreckage, they saw the pattern. The fuel lines ran like veins along the fuselage. Unprotected, the tanks nestled beside engines like powder, waiting for a spark, and yet the craftsmanship was exquisite precision. Its flawless engine mounts perfect balance and harmony. It was as if beauty itself had been sent to die. One pilot, watching the inspection, whispered that these men weren't fools. They were gamblers playing for the soul of their nation. It made him think of his own aircraft, heavy with armor and firepower, built not just to fight, but to survive. That was the American difference: to build for victory, not just valor, to give every man a fighting chance to come home alive. And as the Pacific War raged on, that difference would shape the skies forever. By now, the Betty was no longer just a captured aircraft. It had become a classroom, a warning, and a mirror. The American crews who studied it didn't mock it anymore. They respected it deeply, even as they understood why it failed. They ran firing tests to see what it could withstand. The result were brutal and undeniable. A single burst from a .50 caliber machine gun tore clean through its fuselage. Rounds punched through both sides of the wing, leaving the fuel tanks gushing like open wounds. A single spark, and the plane would vanish into flame. It burned hot and fast like a paper lantern against the tropical sun. Watching it burn, the Americans felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Pride in their own engineering that made their planes tougher, sadness for the men on the other side who faced this horror every time they took off. When the fire died, only twisted aluminum remained. Smell of burnt fuel hung heavy in the air. A young engineer stared at the wreckage and said softly, "This plane was doomed the moment it was designed." But another voice answered, "No, it was built with hope and desperation. And that makes it human." Those words stayed with them because they understood something profound. War is not just about machines and numbers. It is about the decisions made under fear, under pressure, under the weight of survival. And in that moment they saw the real contrast. America, built to endure, to outlast, to bring its men home. Japan, built to strike, to sacrifice, to die with honor. Both believed they were right, but history would remember which one won the skies that day. As the smoke drifted across the runway, one truth became unshakable: courage without protection was tragedy. And that was the lesson the Betty had come to teach. The following weeks turned the captured Betty into a living study for the American engineers. They mapped every bolt, every line, every wire, tracing how the Japanese had built their dream of domination. Through speed, every discovery added to a growing understanding of how to fight smarter, not just harder. The Americans saw that the Betty designers were men of skill, but trapped by scarcity. Japan lacked the resources that America had in abundance. Rubber, aluminum, steel, all rationed, all stretched thin across too many fronts. So the engineers gambled with risk, while American factories built with resilience. At Wright Field and in Pacific Labs, American minds worked day and night, translating lessons from the enemy's mistakes. They tested new forms of self-sealing tanks, lined with special rubber, that swelled on contact with fuel, stopping leaks before flames could start. They strengthened bulk heads, increased pilot armor, refined cooling systems. Every improvement meant one more life saved, one more mission completed, one more victory secured. The Betty became more than an enemy artifact. It was a teacher that pushed American aviation forward. By learning from its flaws, they made the B-17 stronger, the B-24 tougher, the future B-29 nearly untouchable at high altitude. The men who examined the bomber wrote long reports, but what they really carried home was something deeper: a sense of gratitude for the machines that kept them alive. and for the nation that built them without compromise, because America could afford to do what others could not. It could design without fear of shortage, it could build for victory instead of desperation, it could protect its sons in the sky, and still strike harder, farther and faster than any foe. That was the difference that echoed through every factory and every hangar across the United States. The difference between a nation fighting to survive and a nation determined to win by 1944. The skies over the Pacific told a clear story. The Betty still flew, but it was a ghost from another time. America's air power had evolved into something unstoppable, forged by lessons learned from both triumph and tragedy. Let me take you above the clouds where silver wings cut through the light like blades. The American bombers roared with strength, engines tuned to perfection, armor thick enough to shrug off shrapnel and flames. They carried men who trusted the machines beneath them, because they knew those machines had been built with care and foresight. Every bolt, every rivet, every layer of steel carried the promise that they would come home. The enemy still fought with bravery, but bravery alone could not outfly innovation. The Betty's speed meant nothing when radar found it long before it reached its target. Its lack of protection turned every mission into a gamble against physics and fire. While American crews flew with confidence, protected by technology born from understanding the weaknesses of their foes. One U.S. pilot watching a Betty go down in flames after a brief skirmish said quietly, "I almost feel sorry for them," because he knew that somewhere a Japanese mother waited for a son who would never return the sky. Was fair to no one, yet it rewarded those who respected its power. America had learned the lesson and mastered it. Each new mission proved what discipline and design could achieve. The B-29s began pounding Japan from altitudes. No Betty could ever reach their durability, their precision. Their might symbolized not just machines, but ideal strength through intelligence, power guided by compassion and purpose. In the Pacific, the balance of the war had shifted forever. The Betty was now a relic of a nation's overconfidence, while above it the American bombers carved the story of dominance across the clouds of history. By 1944, the skies over the Pacific told a clear story. The Betty still flew, but it was a ghost from another time. America's air power had evolved into something unstoppable, forged by lessons learned from both triumph and tragedy. Let me take you above the clouds where silver wings cut through the light like blades. The American bombers roared with strength, engine tuned to perfection, armor thick enough to shrug off shrapnel and flames. They carried men who trusted the machines beneath them, because they knew those machines had been built with care and foresight. Every bolt, every rivet, every layer of steel carried the promise that they would come home. The enemy still fought with bravery, but bravery alone could not outfly innovation. The Betty's speed meant nothing when radar found it long before it reached its target. Its lack of protection turned every mission into a gamble against physics and fire. Meanwhile, American crews flew with confidence, protected by technology born from understanding the weaknesses of their foes. One U.S. pilot watching a Betty go down in flames after a brief skirmish said quietly, "I almost feel sorry for them," because he knew that somewhere a Japanese mother waited for a son who would never return the sky. Was fair to no one, yet it rewarded those who respected its power. America had learned that lesson and mastered it. Each new mission proved what discipline and design could achieve. The B-29s began pounding Japan from altitudes. No Betty could ever reach their durability, their precision. Their might symbolized not just machines, but ideal strength through intelligence, power guided by compassion and purpose. In the Pacific, the balance of the war had shifted forever. The Betty was now a relic of a nation's overconfidence, while above it the American bombers carved the story of dominance across the clouds of history. The years after the war turned the lessons of the Betty into the foundation of a new era. American engineers no longer just built planes, they built philosophies. Every cockpit became safer, every design smarter, every pilot more protected than the last. The war had taught them that strength was not only in destruction, but in preservation. Factories across America buzzed with the rhythm of creation. Men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, assembling the next generation of aircraft that would rule the skies. They remembered the stories from the Pacific, the burning Bettys falling from the clouds, and the courage of those who flew them. Those memories shaped their hands and minds as they crafted machines meant to survive any fire. Innovation became the heart of American power. Self-sealing fuel systems, pressure cabins, new alloys, radar guidance, jet propulsion. Each step forward was a line drawn between past and future, between what was fragile and what was unbreakable. The United States had proven that power meant nothing without intelligence, that courage must be armed with foresight, that technology, when guided by purpose, could save lives instead of wasting them in the quiet corners of museums. Old Betty bombers stood preserved reminders of both tragedy and triumph. Visitors looked at them with awe, not hatred, because they represented a time when two nations pushed the limits of human ingenuity for vastly different goals. One sought to conquer through speed, the other sought to endure through strength, and as jet engines began to scream across the sky, the world understood something clear and eternal, that America had not only won the war, it had mastered the air itself, through knowledge, through resolve, through an unshakable belief that progress must always protect those who fight for freedom. Let me take you to a quiet airfield at dawn. Rising sun spreads across the wings of a preserved Betty bomber, its faded paint glinting softly under the light. Beside it stands an American pilot, gray-haired eyes sharp, still filled with memory. He looks at the old machine and smiles, not in mockery, but in respect, because this aircraft once stood a symbol of Japan's will to fight against impossible odds. But it also became a lesson that changed the course of aviation forever when those American pilots and engineers first opened its wings and found no armor, no self-sealing tanks, no defense. They saw not just the weakness of an enemy, but the cost of pride unchecked by reason. From that moment onward, the United States would never build with recklessness. Every bomber, every fighter, every carrier-based craft that followed carried within it the hard-learned truth of that discovery, that power must be tempered with wisdom, that victory is not just about destruction, but about survival. The Betty burned because it was built to chase speed. America triumphed because it was built to endure. And in that difference lay the spirit of a nation determined to rise above its enemies, not only in might, but in mind. The old pilot takes a slow breath. He looks toward the open sky. He hears the echo of engines, the ghosts of the men who fought on both sides. Some were lost to fire, some to fate, but all were bound by courage. He turns away and walks toward a silver American bomber, gleaming in the morning light. It represents everything the Betty could not be: resilient, intelligent, unbreakable. And as it lifts into the air once more, its shadow passes over the relic of the past that is the legacy of the captured bomber. A story of discovery, of contrast, of evolution. A story of how America learned from its enemies and built a future where its pilot ruled the skies with unmatched strength and unwavering honor.